As Mike Tyson sits quietly at a small-town diner enjoying a simple meal, trouble finds him. A gang of elderly bigots, self-proclaimed as the old dogs, set their sights on him, their words dripping with malice. What starts as taunts soon escalates into something far worse. One of them ruins his food. Another makes the grave mistake of laying hands on him. In that moment, the air shifts. Mike, ever the composed warrior, gives them a chance to walk away. They don't take it. What follows is a masterclass in power and precision. One by one, the old dogs crumble, their arrogance crushed beneath the fists of a legend. And by the end, they're not just beaten, they're on their knees, pleading for mercy. Stay tuned, subscribe, and like this video to witness how this story unfolds. The town was quiet, the kind of place where life moved at its own slow, steady pace. And nestled within it was Miller's Diner, an old-school joint where the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. A place meant for comfort, not conflict. But tonight, that was about to change. Mike Tyson, a man whose name alone could silence a room, walked in without fanfare. Dressed casually, but peace was not. The warm, welcoming aroma of bacon and fresh coffee hung in the air, wrapping the small diner in a familiar embrace. Conversations hummed, silverware clinked, and life moved as it always had in this quiet corner of town. Then, the door creaked open. A lone figure stepped inside, and though he made no announcement, his presence sent an unspoken ripple through the room. Mike Tyson. A name that carried weight, a name that had been feared, respected, and revered across the world. But tonight, Tyson wasn't here to fight. He was simply a man, wandering through forgotten roads, seeking brief moments of solitude away from the relentless glare of the spotlight. His attire was casual, blending effortlessly with the no-frills atmosphere of Miller's Diner. He wasn't looking for attention, just a meal, a hot, satisfying bite, and maybe a strong cup of coffee to wash away the fatigue of the road. But trouble has a way of finding even the most patient men. Mike took a slow sip of his steaming coffee, letting its warmth settle into his chest. Just a quiet moment before hitting the road again. No cameras, no roaring crowds, just a man and his meal. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Trouble often finds those who least seek it, creeping in like a storm on a cloudless night. The air inside Miller's Diner subtly shifted. An invisible, almost imperceptible change. And yet, Mike felt it. From the farthest booth, tucked into the dimmest corner, came the low rumble of laughter. Not the kind born of joy, but something meaner. Something drenched in an era long past its welcome. 5 men, weathered, scarred, bitter. Their wrinkled hands, etched with faded tattoos, rested against the table as they leaned in, their voices laced with an arrogance that had gone unchecked for decades. These were the old dogs, remnants of a time when their kind could say anything, do anything without fear of consequence. And now, their sharp, leering eyes had found a new target. Mike Tyson. They didn't see the legend. They didn't see the man who had fought his way out of the darkest corners of life and emerged victorious. They saw a challenge, and that mistake would cost them dearly. There was a time when men like them spoke freely, when their hate was met with nods of approval instead of quiet disapproval. A time when intolerance wasn't just accepted, it was expected. But times had changed. They, however, had not. Oblivious to the storm brewing just feet away, the old dogs carried on, their voices dripping with vulgarity, their laughter thick with cruelty. The weight of their words hung in the air like rusted chains, poisoning the very atmosphere of the diner. Mike Tyson remained calm. His focus stayed on the simple pleasure of a meal, a cheeseburger and a hot cup of coffee, as the sounds of sizzling meat and clanking dishes filled the room. But he wasn't deaf. The venom in their voices slithered its way toward him. "Well, well, would you look at that?" One of them sneered, his voice thick with mockery. A hush rippled through the diner. The other patrons pretended not to hear, eyes fixed firmly on their plates. Even the waitress at the counter stiffened, her hands suddenly busy with something that didn't need doing. But Mike heard. He always heard. And the old dogs? They had no idea what they had just started. The words slithered through the air, thick with venom. Well, would you look at that? A big black fella, walking in here like he owns the place. The mutters spread like wildfire, feeding off their shared ignorance. Their voices, once just background noise, now carried an edge sharp enough to cut. A deep, guttural chuckle rumbled from one of the old men, low and cruel, a sound that sent an uneasy ripple through the room. "Probably some thug from the ghetto," another spat, his tone thick with malice. His faded blue eyes narrowed, locked onto Mike like a predator that had no idea it was staring down a lion. "Look at the way he walks, shoulders all broad, chest puffed up. Thinks he owns the place, don't he?" The others laughed, their amusement laced with something bitter, something ugly. Mike let out a slow, measured breath. He had heard it all before. The insults, the stereotypes, the desperate attempts to tear down what they didn't understand. It didn't faze him. Not yet. Because words were just words. But actions had consequences. And if these men were foolish enough to cross that line, if they dared turn their words into something more, then they would learn, firsthand, what it meant to provoke Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson closed his eyes, inhaling slowly. Patience. It was something life had forced him to master. He had faced adversity in every form, on the streets, in the ring, in the unforgiving glare of the spotlight. Compared to that, these bitter old men were nothing more than background noise, their words as insignificant as raindrops against stone. They wanted a reaction. They craved it. But Mike wasn't going to give it to them. Not yet. Instead, he turned his focus back to the meal in front of him. The scent of seared beef, the soft sizzle of the grill, the simple pleasure of a hot meal after a long journey. This was what mattered. Not them. But they weren't done. Like scavengers circling a wounded animal, they mistook his restraint for weakness. And hungry predators always pounced when they thought their prey wouldn't fight back. The scrape of a chair, the shuffle of feet, the weight of unwanted presence pressing closer. Mike felt it before he saw it. One of them had risen from his seat, moving toward him, closing the distance. He could hear the smirk in the old man's voice before he even spoke. And just like that, the choice was no longer Mike's. Trouble had arrived. And Trouble was about to regret it. He rose from his seat slowly, deliberately, like a serpent uncoiling, venom ready to strike. The boldest of the old dogs. A wiry figure, all sharp angles and bad intentions, with sunken eyes that gleamed with a cruel sort of amusement. His weathered face twisted into a sneer, deep lines carved by years of bitterness. The click, click, click of his knuckles tapping against the wood echoed through the diner, a sound as grating as nails on a chalkboard, setting teeth on edge. Then he stopped, right in front of Mike Tyson. Too close. The stench of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey clung to his breath, curling through the air like something rotten. His yellowed teeth flashed as he leaned in, the flickering fluorescent light above casting eerie shadows across his face. "You lost, boy." The words dripped with contempt, thick and slow like tar. His voice wasn't just mocking, it was daring. Daring Mike to react, daring him to care, daring him to make the biggest mistake of his life. And as the diner fell deathly silent, every eye glued to the scene unfolding, Mike finally looked up. And that was when the old man should have known. He had just crossed the point of no return. Like a panther coiled in the underbrush, Mike Tyson slowly lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the old man standing before him. His expression was calm. Too calm. "Just eating my food." The words were simple, spoken without force, but there was something in his tone, an unwavering certainty, an unshakable presence that carried more weight than any shouted threat ever could. The diner fell silent. Every conversation, every movement stopped. The air grew thick, heavy with tension, as if the very walls of the diner were holding their breath. But the old man, he didn't get it. Instead of backing down, his sneer widened, his lips peeling back in a twisted grin of mock superiority. He leaned in, so close that his rancid breath mixed with the scent of Mike's untouched meal. His posture oozed arrogance, his voice a slow, deliberate drawl, laced with the kind of confidence only a fool would have. "This ain't a place for you." The words slithered between them like a blade drawn across a whetstone, sharp, ugly, full of intent. Mike didn't flinch, didn't move. But something in the air shifted, something dangerous. And if the old man had been paying attention, really paying attention, he would have noticed. But he didn't, because men like him never see the storm coming until it's too late. "People like you." The words shot out like venom from a snake, each syllable dripping with the poison of a bygone era, an era where men like him barked orders and others were expected to obey. He leaned in closer, his voice a low, taunting growl. "Used to be. A man like me could tell a man like you to leave, and you'd listen." He said it like a fact, like something carved into stone, like a warning. But his time had long passed. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick and rancid, choking the very life from the room. And then, laughter, a sharp, brittle sound, cutting through the silence. The rest of the old dogs joined in, their cackles shrill and ugly, like a flock of crows picking at a carcass. They weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because they needed to, because without their numbers, without the validation of their pack, there was nothing left of them but fear. Mike Tyson sat motionless, unshaken, unmoved. He took a slow, measured breath, his broad chest rising and falling with eerie calm. He had seen this before, lived through it, fought against it. And right now, he wasn't just inhaling air. He was inhaling the weight of the moment, the tension, the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Because soon, very soon, they would learn exactly who they had just provoked. Mike exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He wasn't new to this. He had spent a lifetime facing men like these, small-minded, insecure, clinging to their outdated sense of superiority like a life raft in a world that had moved on without them. They feared what they didn't understand. They lashed out at what they couldn't control. And yet, Mike had nothing to prove to them. No interest in playing their game. No time to stoop to their level. He was prepared to let it go. Then, a mistake was made. A fatal mistake. With a sudden jerky movement, the old man's gnarled hand shot forward, reaching for Mike's plate. A move born not of hunger, but of sheer spite. Entitlement. A man like him had likely spent his whole life taking things that didn't belong to him, thinking he could act without consequence. But there were always consequences. The cheeseburger never made it off the plate. Because in that instant, something shifted. Mike's eyes, dark and unreadable just moments before, flashed. Like twin orbs of volcanic fury, a raw, untamed heat burning behind them. A warning, a reckoning, an unspoken declaration that the game had just changed. The old dogs had spent their lives believing they were the predators. But now, staring into Mike Tyson's eyes, they realized they were the prey. A storm was brewing behind Mike Tyson's eyes. The kind of storm that didn't just rage, it consumed. His gaze, once calm and measured, now burned white-hot, like the moment before a wildfire ignites, like a predator who has just decided that mercy is off the table. And yet, the old man didn't see it. He was too busy reveling in his own ignorance. With a sudden twisted grin, he snatched the coffee cup from the table, his hand trembling. Not with fear, but with something far uglier. Spite. Malice. The thrill of thinking he had some kind of power over a man like Mike Tyson. Oops. The word slithered from his lips, soaked in venom as he tipped the cup forward. Scalding black coffee cascaded over the plate, drenching the once-perfect cheeseburger, soaking into the thin paper until it nearly disintegrated under its own weight. Ruined. Destroyed. A meal that had been nothing more than a simple moment of peace was now a casualty of arrogance. And in that moment, the air in the diner changed. The low hum of conversation vanished. The clatter of silverware ceased. The world itself seemed to pause. Because everyone knew. They knew what the old man didn't. They knew that lines had just been crossed. And they knew that Mike Tyson was about to respond. The air was thick. So thick it felt like the walls of the diner were closing in, pressing down on everyone inside. No one spoke. No one moved. The other patrons, whether out of fear or sheer survival instinct, averted their eyes. Some stared at their plates as if they had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in the world. Others kept their gazes locked on the floor, hands gripping their cups like lifelines. Even the waitress, standing frozen behind the counter, her hands trembling ever so slightly, looked paralyzed. This wasn't just tension. This was something else. The weight of inevitability. Mike Tyson's jaw clenched, his muscles flexing beneath his skin, the sinews in his neck taut like cables under strain. But he didn't move. Not yet. He sat there still as stone, a monolith of control amidst the chaos, holding back something volcanic. And that was a mistake. Because when a storm builds without release, it doesn't just break, it destroys. That was a mistake. The words came slow, deliberate, each syllable laced with something dangerous. Mike Tyson didn't yell. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of his voice carried a promise that had been made countless times before, in rings under bright lights, in back alleys where only the strong walked away. Retribution was coming. And yet, the old man didn't see it. He mistook Mike's stillness for hesitation, mistook his silence for weakness, and that made him laugh. Not a normal laugh, a sick, manic sound that cracked through the diner like breaking glass. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it, tough guy?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, the storm broke. With a sudden burst of movement, the old dogs sprang from their seats, their chairs scraping against the floor in a discordant symphony of aggression. A pack of hyenas, emboldened by their numbers, advancing toward a lion. They moved as one, their bodies radiating hatred, arrogance, and the sheer stupidity of men who had never faced true power. They encircled him, their presence a tightening noose, their sneers sharp enough to cut. But they had already lost. Because when you corner a man like Mike Tyson, you don't walk away. Electricity crackled in the air. Like a live wire snapping between them, the tension erupted. A violent storm that had been brewing since the moment Mike walked through the door. And just like that, instinct took over. The way it always had. The way it always would. A freight train of precision and brutality, honed through decades of battle, unleashed in the blink of an eye. One of the old dogs, too slow, too stupid, made the first move. Big mistake. Mike caught his wrist mid-strike, an iron vise snapping shut. There was no hesitation, no second chances. With a single twist, the air split with the sickening pop of ligaments tearing, the brutal snap of bone giving way. A howl of agony ripped through the diner. Before the old man could even process the pain, he was airborne. Mike sent him crashing into the nearest booth, his body hitting the wooden frame with such force that it splintered under the impact. Dishes shattered, silverware clattered. A symphony of shattered bones and broken pride. And in that moment, as the first of the old dogs lay sprawled in a heap, groaning in pain, the others finally realized they weren't up against a man. They were up against a force of nature, and nature doesn't show mercy. The old dogs froze. Shock, rage, fear. It flashed across their faces in the same instant, their predatory advance stumbling to a halt. Mike Tyson rose, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The diner itself seemed to shrink as he came to his full height, a presence so commanding, so undeniable, that even the air felt heavier. This was no longer a fight. This was a reckoning. His face, carved from stone, revealed nothing but calculated intent. His silence wasn't hesitation. It was a sentence. The message was clear. You crossed the line. Now, you pay the price. The atmosphere shifted, thick as an oncoming storm. The fluorescent lights above flickered, their hum the only sound in a room where even breathing felt too loud. The other patrons, they weren't watching a bar fight. They were witnessing a moment of inevitability. And deep down, the old dogs knew it too. Their laughter was gone. Their arrogance shattered. Because for the first time in their miserable lives, they were the ones being hunted. The diner felt smaller. The walls seemed to press in, the weight of the moment suffocating. The other patrons shrank into their seats, unwilling or unable to intervene. Because this wasn't a simple bar fight. This was a battle between titans, and the old dogs, desperate and cornered, made their final mistake. They attacked. Not with skill, not with precision, but with desperation. Their movements were sloppy, telegraphed, a staccato of clumsy swings thrown by men who had spent their lives fighting only when the odds were in their favor. One of them, fueled by rage and sheer stupidity, swung wildly at Mike's head, his fist careening through the air with all the subtlety of a falling boulder. Too slow, far too slow. Mike moved with the effortless grace of a champion, a simple twist and step sending the punch whistling past him, harmless and pathetic. And then, he struck. The next attacker barely had time to react before Mike's fist collided with his ribs. A blow so fast, so precise, it was like lightning finding its mark. The sound, a deep, sickening crunch, echoed through the diner, followed by a strangled gasp as the man's body folded in on itself. His eyes, once wild with aggression, widened with something new. Pain, shock, regret. And before he could even hit the floor, Mike was already turning to the next, because this wasn't a fight anymore. This was a lesson. The next man charged, blinded by rage, nothing but raw aggression pushing him forward, like a bull seeing red. But Mike didn't move. He stood his ground, solid, unshaken, immovable. And when the old dog got close enough, when the weight of his own momentum made stopping impossible, Mike struck. Not with a punch. He didn't need one. A single, perfectly timed shove sent the man hurtling backward, his own force turned against him. He collided with the diner counter, hard. The impact rattled the entire structure, a metallic crash shaking the room as a cascade of silverware and dishes rained down. Plates shattered, glass splintered, forks and knives clattered across the tile floor like the aftermath of an earthquake, and at the center of it all, the old dog, slumped in the wreckage, groaning, broken. His face, twisted in pain and disbelief, no longer held the arrogance it had minutes before. He had walked into a war he was never meant to win. And now? He wasn't walking out at all. Survival instinct kicked in. The wiry leader, once so smug, so sure of himself, ran, not with confidence, not with arrogance, but with pure, unfiltered desperation. His legs pumped frantically, his breath came in ragged gasps, his boots slapping against the tile floor as he made a break for the exit. He never made it. Mike was too fast, too relentless. Before the old man could reach the door, a hand like iron clamped around his collar. And then he was airborne, lifted effortlessly, as if he weighed nothing at all, as if he were a misbehaving child caught red-handed. Mike held him there, suspended, their faces mere inches apart. The diner, once filled with laughter and venom, was now silent. All eyes were on Mike, on the legend, on the apex predator who had just claimed his prey. His voice was low, steady, deadly, a rumble that vibrated through the very bones of the man he held. You You were talking real big a second ago. The bravado was gone, stripped away, shattered, left in the rubble with the others. What remained? Nothing but fear. The old man, the so-called leader, was gone. Not physically, but everything that made him feel powerful had been stripped away. The arrogance, the bravado, the hate-fueled confidence, all of it, obliterated. What remained was nothing but a shell of a man, trembling in the iron grip of Mike Tyson. The raw primal power radiating from Mike was overwhelming. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something ancient, the kind of power that didn't need to be explained, only respected. And now? The old man finally understood. His voice, once sharp with venom, collapsed into a pathetic stammer. Please, man. It was just a joke. The words tumbled out in a broken, wheezing mess. A plea, a last-ditch attempt at escape. But there was no escape. Mike's eyes narrowed, his gaze cutting through the man like a blade. His expression didn't change, didn't soften. The lines on his face were carved deep, not with rage, but with something even more terrifying. Contempt. Slowly, deliberately, Mike turned his head, his focus shifting to the waitress. She stood frozen, hands clasped, transfixed by what she had just witnessed. Because this wasn't just violence. This was justice. The waitress stood frozen, hands clasped together as if in prayer. Because in that moment, she wasn't just watching. She was bearing witness. Mike's voice cut through the silence, sharp, unforgiving. Did it sound like a joke to you? It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. His words sliced through the thick, suffocating fog of fear that had settled over the diner. Though aimed at the waitress, they echoed beyond her, filling the room, pressing into every chest, demanding an answer from everyone who had watched and done nothing. The waitress, still paralyzed, barely managed to shake her head. Her silence spoke volumes. It told the truth that the old man, now trembling in Mike's grasp, could no longer deny. And as Mike looked down at him, at the pathetic wreckage of arrogance and hate, a thought flickered through his mind. This man had once believed himself untouchable. Now he was nothing. Mike could feel it, the primal urge, the deep instinctual need to strike, to unleash the beast, to make this man feel in his bones the weight of every hateful word, every action fueled by ignorance. But Mike Tyson was more than just a fighter, more than just raw power and explosive violence. He was a man of principle, a warrior whose battles had taught him discipline, restraint, the ability to choose when and where to strike. And this wasn't a fight. This was a lesson. His strength, coiled and tense like a spring loaded to explode, suddenly released. Not in an attack, but in control. With effortless force, he let go, dropping the old man unceremoniously into a nearby booth. The man gasped, his breath shaky, his limbs trembling. The fear was still there, still carved into his face, still clinging to his every movement. But now, it was joined by something else. Recognition. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at just another man. He was looking at something greater. And he knew it. The old man sat paralyzed, his body betraying him with violent tremors. Because now, he understood. He understood just how close he had come to catastrophe. And yet Mike wasn't done. He leaned in slowly, deliberately, his face mere inches from the old man's. The weight of his presence alone was suffocating. Then came his voice, low, steady, unshakable. A whispered rumble that seemed to vibrate through the old man's bones. Next time you open your mouth, think twice about who you're talking to. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried an unspoken promise, one far more terrifying than any threat. The old man quivered, his breath hitching, his hands gripping the edge of the booth as if the world itself was slipping out from under him. Because he knew. He knew that Mike Tyson wasn't just any man. He wasn't just a fighter. He was an icon, a legend, a force of nature whose reputation alone could bring men like him to their knees. And tonight, he had survived by nothing more than mercy. The shockwave of what had just happened still hung in the air, heavy, suffocating, inescapable, like the aftermath of an atomic blast. The old dogs lay scattered across the diner floor, their bodies a patchwork of bruises, shattered pride, and regret. A chorus of groans and whimpers filled the room. Once proud men, now nothing more than broken remnants of their own arrogance. Their confidence had been paper thin, and Mike Tyson had torn straight through it. The diner itself felt smaller, as if the very walls had absorbed the raw, explosive energy of the encounter. The air was still thick, charged with the residue of violence, a battle that had nearly tipped into something far worse. And yet, through it all, Mike stood unmoved, a pillar of calm, a man who had faced adversity before and walked through the fire, again and again, without ever being consumed by it. This wasn't his first war, and it sure as hell wouldn't be his last. Mike turned away, his movement slow, deliberate, like a warrior walking off the battlefield, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of arrogance and misplaced pride. The diner was silent, save for the labored groans of the defeated men sprawled across the floor. And then, a sudden movement. The waitress darted forward, her soft footsteps barely making a sound against the worn linoleum. She stopped in front of Mike, her eyes wide, filled with something that hadn't been there before. Gratitude, respect, awe. Her hands, still clasped together as if in prayer, trembled slightly as she looked up at him. Her voice, when it finally came, was a whisper, almost reverent. "Thank you." Two simple words, yet they held so much. She searched his face, as if trying to find the right way to express the depth of what she felt. But words weren't enough, and she knew it. Mike held her gaze, his own eyes, once blazing with fury, now softened. A gesture of understanding, of empathy. Because tonight, he hadn't just fought. He had reminded everyone in that diner what real strength looked like. Mike met her gaze, steady, unwavering. No problem. His voice was warm, reassuring in a way that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. Then, with the same calm certainty that had just dismantled an entire gang of fools, he added, "And don't let guys like that scare you." Simple words. But they carried weight, a gesture of kindness and strength, like an anchor in a storm. And for the first time that night, the waitress breathed. The tension that had locked her body eased, her hands relaxing, her shoulders dropping just slightly. She nodded, her eyes glistening, not just with fear, but with something else, something closer to relief. Because tonight, in this small-town diner where darkness had tried to take hold, she had seen something rare. Proof that there were still heroes among us. Mike turned, stepping out into the night. The cool air wrapped around him, cleansing, quiet, so different from the suffocating heat inside. For a moment he stood there, eyes closed, listening. The distant hum of the city, the whisper of the wind, the world moving forward, unfazed, unaware of what had just transpired. And as he inhaled deeply, taking in the stillness, one thought crossed his mind. It was over. For now. The world was still the same. A place where ignorance and hatred lurked beneath the surface, waiting, always waiting, for the chance to rise, to infect, to spread. But tonight, they had been put in their place. 5 men who had spent their lives believing in their own untouchable arrogance had been reminded of a truth as old as time itself. Actions have consequences. And in a world that often felt dark and indifferent, heroes still existed, even in the most unlikely of places. Mike exhaled, a slow shake of his head following as the sheer absurdity of it all finally settled in. He had walked into this diner for one reason, a meal. And now? His burger, once a beacon of comfort, was nothing more than a soggy, ruined mess. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. Out of all the things that had happened tonight, this was what truly annoyed him. His burger had been a casualty of the night's chaos. Mike glanced at the mess on the table one last time, then let out a resigned sigh. With a shrug, he turned and made his way toward the door, slow, unbothered, untouchable. The night air greeted him with a crisp stillness as he slid into his car, the soft hum of the engine breaking the silence. His mind had already moved on. The next stop, a quiet place, a simple meal, a burger he could actually enjoy without interruption. But as he drove away from Miller's diner, he carried with him a truth he had long known, one that had been reinforced tonight. Hatred and ignorance will always lurk in the shadows, waiting, plotting, searching for weakness. But when faced with courage, dignity, and unshakable strength, they are powerless. And for the 5 men who had dared challenge him tonight, their arrogance had been their downfall. They had started this fight believing they were in control. But in the end, they had been taught a lesson they would never forget. And Mike just wanted his damn burger. Their downfall had been inevitable. Not because of fate, not because of bad luck, but because of their own ignorance. A seed of destruction, planted by their own hands, had finally taken root and bloomed in the harshest way possible. And as Mike drove into the night, his thoughts drifted, not to the fight, not to the broken men left behind, but to the lesson they had been forced to learn. A lesson that had been true for centuries. Never judge a man by the color of his skin, because behind that mask could be a heart of gold or fists of iron. And tonight, they had discovered exactly which one they had provoked. Thank you for listening to the whole story. Have a good day.